Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I was asked to come and talk about, kind of give an overview of where interactive fiction has been and where it's going in this kind of long-term timeline way. And I realized as I was putting this talk together that I had gotten myself into a little bit of trouble, because on the one hand, there's a lot out there already about the past of interactive fiction, the past of text adventures, and while I have more things to say about that, I didn't want to be kind of telling everybody about the same canonical works that they might already know about in this field. And then my second problem is that I was promising to talk about the future of interactive fiction, and I have a terrible track record when it comes to this. If I go back and look at interviews where somebody has asked me 5 or 10 years ago where I think IF is going, my responses are comically off base. So I thought, well, so I could do a talk where I'm basically telling you some of what you already know about what happened, and then some total lies about the future. Or I could slightly shift the way that I'm doing this. So what I thought I would do instead is this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at, over the course of the past several decades, what have people been seeing as, from their point of view in that moment, the future of IF? What did they think was going to happen? What did they hope was going to happen? What did they see as experimental games that had some kind of promise? And then what actually did happen with those possible futures? And that doesn't necessarily get us to the point where we can extrapolate for sure from where we are now, but at least it will be, I will feel slightly less fraudulent doing the talk, which has its own inherent value. So there is a necessary starting point for this conversation, which is Crowther and Wood's adventure, Colossal Cave, whichever way you want to take that, which is kind of the text adventure, the story of entering this caving space, exploring it, moving through it, using different compass directions, using the ability to enter adjacent rooms, pick up objects, solve puzzles, defeat enemies that come up against you. So this is the sort of point in the late 70s where this game became prevalent on mainframe computers all over the world. People who had access to those systems were playing with it, revising it, rewriting it, coming up with alternate ways of experiencing this kind of story. But it comes back to this initial description of a place and experience we're putting you as a character in a particular spot. And this quite rapidly became a source of interesting commercial possibilities as well. So we saw a number of different commercial entities, Level 9, Melbourne House, Infocom, Scott Adams, different groups of people building versions of this kind of experience, this sort of basic text adventure for home computers. And even at those very early points, people were already starting to think about where can we go that would take this format in a new direction. So here you have Sierra's Mystery House, where they've figured out how to do very sort of basic vector line drawings to enhance the situation. You start to get location images per location in the game, and so foreseeing a future in which every spot you went to was illustrated as one possibility. And obviously that is a future that did go someplace in that, point-and-click adventure games came about, as you all know. But this also was not the only direction that commercial games continued to take. 1982, we have The Hobbit, where there are very active non-player characters running around, characters who are making their own decisions, taking their own actions. The sort of key line from this that everybody remembers or refers back to is Thorin sits down and starts singing about gold. You've got these characters who will do sort of in-scene things in order to kind of express who they are as characters or to push the story forward. And again, this was something that was ambitious, that sometimes led to sort of fantastically bizarre bug states, and was not necessarily universally taken up in other commercial work at the time. It was kind of a concept of what could happen from there. In the Infocom catalog, you get Infidel in 1983, which is their first piece of interactive fiction, their first text adventure, where the ending is unhappy. You are playing as a Western archaeologist who's exploring a pyramid in Egypt. You haven't particularly treated your team of helpers very well, and they've gone off without you. And it's clear that the protagonist is just not a nice person, and that you're approaching this whole process of archaeology with a desire to just kind of loot the place. And it's the first game that really kind of extrapolates, okay, if you are this kind of character, this kind of protagonist who is trying to go through this space and grab every valuable thing you can see and exploit every situation you can find, that actually makes you not a nice person. And what is an appropriate outcome for behaving that way? So this is a game where you get all the way through all of the puzzles, and I know I'm spoiling this for you, but you've had a long time to possibly play this. You get to the end and you do not, in fact, make it out with all of your stolen possessions. And so that kind of raises the possibility of there can be a game with the goal state, but the goal state doesn't really reward the protagonist. And so that was kind of an interesting possibility. Mine Forever Voyaging, 1985, you start to get the possibility of games that are about doing serious political intent in interactive fiction. So this is a story in which you're able to explore simulated futures. This is the point of this is to explore simulated futures that carry forward the politics of the day and their implications, and give you a chance to look at what are the implications of basically sort of a Reagan economy and some of the things that go with that in this particular fiction, and what could go right and what could go wrong with that. And this is an attempt to kind of break out of the straightforwardly game-like experience in a different way and focus on leading you into a particular rhetorical position from that experience. So again, none of these pieces, I mean, there was Infidel, and then most of the games that Infocom did after that had happy endings. Mine Forever Voyaging, and most of the games they did after that continue to be not particularly deep intent kinds of stories. 1985, another of my favorites from then is Wishbringer, which has multiple puzzle solutions. And this is a place where the Infocom and other sort of commercial groups who are exploring the problem of how do we make games that are going to be sufficiently accessible for a wider audience. So we're breaking out beyond what is going to work for hardcore, really dedicated computer owners who are adults who want to spend months playing these games and possibly writing into magazines to ask for hints. They have that level of commitment that, I mean, I have a hard time if I get stuck on a game and I can't find a walkthrough within the next half hour. So the idea of like actually writing away to a magazine and then waiting for 2 months for the column to come back and tell me how to get past the dwarf, like they were really committed. But this is a point where they're starting to think about game design that would give people a route around that. So Wishbringer introduces the possibility of playing different puzzles at different difficulty levels, and if you find the hard solution, good for you, but if you want to use the easy solution, then you can make progress through the game anyway, and kind of opens up this possibility of targeting a broader group of people. Alter Ego. Some people might or might not classify this as sort of classic interactive fiction, but this is another piece of like an interesting sort of message from the 80s hair and 80s politics. Alter Ego is a game. It came in two versions, the male version and the female version, where you're allowed to tell it what you would do in a host of situations over the course of your lifetime, starting out as a baby, as a toddler, making sort of choices that affect how risk-taking you are as a little kid, and moving on through the entire course of your life. And it's really a game about exploring the implications of those choices and who you're becoming as a protagonist. So not so much about, I'm going to tell you one story and I'm going to lead you through that via a series of puzzles, but I'm going to let you explore who you want to be, you want to shape the protagonist to be, and what that would mean in this context. It's also, as some people have pointed out, an interesting kind of regressive piece, because even though this gives you an entire lifespan to live out, it envisions basically all of the future as being exactly like the 80s. So, you know, you get into kind of middle age or later, and you're basically dealing with the same situation that you were as a child. This is one of my favorites, and I've become more and more willing to say it's one of my favorites as time has gone on. Plundered Hearts is the first IF game that I ever actually finished on my own, got all the way to the end of, and it is one of the sort of late Infocom pieces, again looking into what are the possibilities if we're reaching out beyond the audience that we already expect to have and the people who are already buying our games? What if we think about possibly women game players? You would think that as people were thinking about this in the 80s, we would be done with that argument now, but unfortunately not. But this is alongside the fact that it is a swashbuckling romance story with lots of, you swing from chandeliers and you sneak poison into people's food, and it's really fun. And it also has one of the most sort of extensive plots of any of the games that were coming out at this point, and a lot of things that happened quite a bit later on in interactive fiction development. You can really find some antecedents in this particular piece of, this is a game that is ambitious about giving you kind of a nice narrative arc. This is a piece that is ambitious about having lots of non-player characters running around and having their own plots and their own desires that you're interacting with in these intense person-to-person scenes, and just kind of takes that part of the interactive fiction text adventure experience someplace that it mostly hadn't explored too much before. Also, 1987, Infocom is thinking about what can we do that goes beyond that sort of standard presentation of a text adventure. So if we introduce some RPG elements and some automatic mapping. So this is a screenshot from Beyond Zork, where you can see that it's actually given you kind of room description at the top and a little map that's it's coming out as you play along. And this is really the point at which, this branching out that Infocom was doing was an attempt to broaden their audience and their commercial appeal, and they were laying some groundwork for other possibilities. And then what happened was they went out of business instead. And so this is the point where kind of the story of interactive fiction development shifts towards the hobbyist community, which existed at first on places like CompuServe, then on Usenet, subsequently on bulletin boards. People who really had loved and enjoyed interactive fiction and text adventures in their classic form still wanted to write them, still wanted to distribute them. Some people were sharing shareware, but after a fairly short period of time, after a few years, it became much more kind of a freeware group. And what happened for much of the sort of early 90s stretch between sort of 1992 and 1995 or 96 and there was people making new tools that could reproduce what had been done before commercially. So a lot of that was being kind of re-explored and recreated, and just how do we get this ability back at a quality level that's equivalent to what we were doing commercially. But in the late 90s, that you start to see people getting ambitious again about what is, not to say that the earlier projects were not ambitious, but the question of what does the future of this medium look like starts to recur. And this is the point at which, so what I've been talking about so far, those are things that you may already be familiar with and you may have heard of before. But this gets into the point where people are getting much more speculative about what could we possibly do with this medium that goes beyond what anybody's done before, not inside the sort of standards of the commercial work that's already out there. And so 1996, you get a game called In the End, which is one of the first pieces of really intentionally puzzle-less works, and it's about sort of dealing with depression and suicidal acquaintances and being in this position where everything is kind of hopeless and distressing, and telling the story of that experience without any kind of puzzles as barrier, but just allowing you to explore a space and a mindset in a text adventure style way, but with a very different kind of intention. So this is kind of picking up some of the threads of something like Infidel, the idea that this doesn't necessarily have to have a goal with a happy ending, but it's breaking out a lot more from the mechanical expectations at the time. And this was something that was really quite hotly debated. It doesn't now seem particularly controversial, but at the time on Usenet groups there was a lot of discussion about, is it possible to do something with this that is compelling at all? Can you give somebody a powerful experience within a text adventure if they're not solving puzzles. Like, what else would you want to do but solve puzzles, obviously? So this actually picked up, it was not in itself recognized as necessarily the greatest work ever, although people were very interested in it. But it did kind of establish that possibility space, and it was picked up almost immediately by other games that wanted to go further with that idea. So you're much more likely to have heard of, if you know some text adventure and some interactive fiction, you're much more likely to have heard of Photopia from 1998, which is Adam Kadri's really sort of powerful story about a traffic accident. I'm going to be serially spoiling every great IF game, by the way, but I won't tell you exactly what happens at the end of that one. But it is also predominantly puzzle-less and very much influenced by this idea of what if we make this experience be about talking to characters? What if we make it be about evoking a particular mood rather than focusing on how do you get a light source, how do you get a key to get past this particular puzzle? 1998, we also start to see people who really, HTML has taken off enough that people start to get excited about the idea of, what if there were IF that looked like a web page? And, of course, it's what if there were IF that looks like a web page in 1998? But you start to get some initial explorations of that. So the tool TADS gets an HTML TADS feature, and this is one of the first things that was done with HTML TADS. It's a Golden Skull, which is an example piece by NK Guy, and has all of these kind of interspersed illustrations. And although, in one sense you could say, oh, okay, this is basically just, there are plenty of illustrated adventures in the world. Why is this, striking or groundbreaking or interesting? But what these pieces are trying to do is something genuinely, distinctly different from what a point-and-click adventure is trying to do, or even those kind of location-illustrated games that Sierra was doing, because they tend to be about something that has a more book-like attitude towards what illustration is doing in the game. So you get sort of spot illustrations, pictures here and there, that don't necessarily faithfully represent world state, so you don't necessarily expect that, okay, if I get this image up there, that is going to continue to represent exactly what is going on. It's more like, here is a plate as though it were in a book, and I page onto the next page, something else happens, that illustration doesn't change, but we've got a different kind of relationship between these things, between the illustration aspect and the text aspect. And this, again, is a thing where several people made interesting experiments in this space. Toolset existed to do it, and then not a great deal happened for at least another 10 years. People would occasionally make illustrated pieces, they would occasionally make pieces that had music tie-in as well as some kind of soundtrack. But for the most part, there wasn't really a lot of movement on this front, and part of it was because I think it's asking for more skills from the author. One of the great things about hobbyist interactive fiction is that it was always a medium in which people could work as single individuals. So you didn't necessarily have to have collaborators. You just needed to be an okay level of programmer and have some writing ability, and then you could do it. So as you layer on, and you also would want to be able to make illustrations, and you also would want to make music, then this sort of ability to deliver that falls off a bit. But there was this kind of, there was a brief period between 1998 and 2000, I would say, where the IF community was like, yes, this is definitely, multimedia IF is totally happening. This is going to be the wave of the future any minute now. And then, there was a long pause. Sam Barlow you've probably heard of because of her story and because of some of his other work. This is actually the first point at which I heard of Sam Barlow was his game Isle in 1999. And this is a one-move piece. You are shopping in a supermarket and you can pick one thing to do while you're shopping. You could be examining the things around you. You could be looking at the pasta on the shelf. You could be attempting to kiss the woman who is also shopping in the same aisle. You have all of these different kind of possibilities. And every time you make a move, you get an ending. It gives you a different sort of resulting piece of story at that point. And those endings, sort of, if you piece them together, suggest this backstory of what's happened to you, this sort of tragic romance that you had that went wrong. You were in Italy, things didn't go well. Some of the variations, like depending on exactly what you do, not all of the endings line up perfectly. But this also is a completely different vision of what interactive fiction could be for and what it could be doing than a lot of the work that had come before it, because it's focused on this possibility of getting the player to play through all of these different short experiences in order to piece together a narrative understanding. It's not about solving a puzzle in the world model and overcoming an obstacle like a dragon or something like that. It's about piecing together this puzzle of what does this mean? And if I explore this narrative space, what do I get out of that? So there have been previous games that were doing multiple endings, but to do it on this scale and to expect the interaction to be something quite different was also really exciting to people. So this is another point where people were sort of thinking, okay, well, maybe we need to, kind of re-explore what we're doing with the structure of these things. All right, this is the point at which I sheepishly include something that I did. So 2000, I made a piece called Galatea, which is about a conversation with a character. It's a one-room game. You go into a space, which is an art gallery. Galatea is a statue who has been brought to life by Pygmalion in the classic myth. In this version of the story, you actually belong to a society that's sort of science fictionally advanced enough that you have interesting robots that can basically sort of android-like art pieces that you can interact with and ask questions of, and there's a lot of craft around making them look convincing and act convincing. I mean, that's part of the fiction. And so you can ask her questions and get answers back and kind of drive your relationship with her towards, again, many different endings. And I was very much inspired by Isle in this regard. There are a number of different states that you can get your relationship with her into. And part of where I was coming from on this was most of the characters that I encountered in interactive fiction up to this point were there for a very obvious gameplay reason. Like, they are there to block your progress, they're a guard of something, they're there to require you to do a fetch quest and then come back. They have, or maybe they're giving you some important piece of information, but they have a very specific gameplay purpose, and they also have no memory whatsoever. And if you ask them the same question over and over again, they will give you the same answer over and over again. If you take their stuff, they won't remember that you took their stuff. They're just completely, usable non-entities in the game world. And I wanted to make something where the experience was more about an ongoing relationship with the character where they were capable of having some emotional state and you might develop some empathy with them. So she does remember what you've talked about before. She does have an attitude towards you that evolves, and how you treat her determines where things go from there. And I was hoping at the time, I would like to see, ideally, more games that incorporate that kind of interaction, and possibly more games that just are conversations, because I think that's a really interesting kind of space to make into a game. At the other end of the spectrum, Dangerous Curves is a piece in which the world model is incredibly enormous and incredibly detailed. Irene Kolachi put a lot of time and energy into creating this noir murder mystery, and it has all of the rooms and all of the spaces and all of the characters that you need to interrogate, and then there are just buildings full of additional rooms and additional buildings and additional, you go into an office building and all of the rooms in the office building exist, and they all have desks, and the desks all have pencils in them. A lot of her, so she was sort of posting on the news groups about what she was doing with this, and how she was kind of constantly running up against the limits of what the interactive fiction tools were willing to do, because she had far, far too many objects, many of which were, for instance, erasers, into this game. But it's this incredibly ambitious vision of an interactive fiction where the environment is lovingly, deeply detailed at a kind of sandbox level that we now would associate with something like L.A. Noire, one of these sort of big AAA, and obviously it wasn't presented as a AAA experience, but the idea of this story is encased in a world that is convincing because every single piece of it has been lovingly detailed into place. And if you want to wander way off track and go look at all of that stuff, it is all there. And that was something that people were talking about a lot at this point. Like, can we do this? What's required to do it? What would happen if we tried to kind of open up a holodeck-like experience for players where the world really is that deeply engaging, that deeply simulated, and all of the pieces are there? What would that be like? What would it be like if we let the player choose their own goals in that kind of space? And can we still say that's narrative or not? So there was a lot of kind of cycling around this and a lot of anticipation around what could possibly happen. And then yet a third, I've got three things from 2000 because 2000 was really an extraordinary year. And I'm not just saying that because that's when I started releasing things. Anyway, 1998 was also a great year. So this piece, being Andrew Plotkin, is riffing quite obviously off being John Malkovich. And it's a piece by J. Robinson Wheeler, who his background is in film, and he's done some independent film work in the past. And he was bringing sort of yet a third style. So we talked about sort of deep conversational IF, we've talked about big, rich world IF, and this was a third vision still, which is something where the plot is really keeps ticking forward. No matter what you do, each moment you're in some kind of narrative scene. And you can interact with other characters, but the world does not stand still for you. You have to make decisions as things are going by. You can miss opportunities, you can get things wrong, but there's this sense of really forward-moving narrative pace, and that was also really exciting for a lot of people at the time. So there's kind of this discussion of like which of these things is going to be where we're going, which of them is most effective in telling a really compelling story, what do we want out of all of this? 2001 Ramses. This one you may well have heard of. It is a piece about an Irish schoolboy who is bullied at his boarding school and is very frustrated about that and keeps thinking of the amazing things, the witty and snarky comebacks that he would make if only he had the courage to do so. And as the player, you're constantly saying, like, yes, say this thing back. Like, here is the comeback you need. Stand up for yourself. Go for it. Do it. And every time you do that, he has some reason why he can't, and why he needs to be quiet, and why he needs to put up with being in the situation that he's in. And he's very unhappy, but you as a player cannot budge him from that unhappiness. You cannot push him out of that space. It is always kind of there. And to the end of the game, he remains basically who he is. And as a piece exploring the inside of the protagonist's mind, this goes far beyond most of the rest of what was out there. And so this kind of led to a bunch of discussion about how do we make protagonists who are interactive, who are representing the player, but who nonetheless really are quite engrossed in some issues of their own. It really is their story in a way that's tightly characterized and not particularly dependent on what the player is bringing into this, but is something that's more about the player managing being somebody very different from who they themselves might be at home. Like, you might be somebody who is very fond of sort of letting fly with whatever your thoughts might be in the moment. You can't play that person here. This is one of my favorite obscure pieces, Forever Always. So one of the other things we're talking about in 2002 a lot was a kind of recurring problem. So we'd be really interested in outreach, how we get more people engaged with IF, and also how we push forward the experience of communicating with the game. And one of the things that we were interested in was, okay, commands that we currently have, get the lamp, take this, open the door, those don't really cover anything like the range of natural language human input. And wouldn't it be more fun if we had games that were actually able to understand a much wider range of inputs, and wouldn't that also be more pleasant for players? And so Forever Always is a Scottish romance game in which you have to prevent your beloved from marrying the wrong person. And it's just, some of you may not be able to see the instructions here, but it says, this game uses a somewhat unconventional conversation system. You can't talk to anyone, and you can't ask or tell about anything. All you can do is talk directly. However, what you can do is vary the tone of your speech by typing commands like shout, whisper, growl, and so on. And you can also use adverbs. For instance, you can bristle angrily or muse thoughtfully. However, be warned that the adverb will remain in effect until you switch to a different one. So if you get into your character into an angrily format, they will go on perhaps whispering angrily, growling angrily, etc. For the next several turns. And this is kind of trying to push what the parser could do into some of its edge cases. And this is not the only example of this from around this time, but it's one of the ones that I find most entertaining. But people were also doing things like, what if we made the input sentence able to be much longer than it otherwise would be? What if we were able to understand more prepositional phrases? There's a game called Rematch that's about playing over and over and over again until you find the exact, really quite long command that is going to solve your problem in one move. So there was this idea of, like, maybe we could do something where novice players don't feel so unnerved by having to learn what the verbs are to communicate with this system. Maybe we could do something where it's just much more good at acting like an English understanding GM might. If you were actually having a tabletop experience, wouldn't it be great if it could comprehend you at anything like that level? And people were also speculating about things like, well, what if we bolted a chat bot sort of onto the front end of this, like we had if you had sort of standard chatbot software, and then that was taking lots of different forms of input, and then it was sort of pre-compiling that and figuring out of all of these different things that the player could have typed in, like most of these actually just mean take lamp, and then most of these actually just mean go east, and sort of translating for you that way. So there was a lot of exploration around that, and a lot of sort of different attempts to get that situation to solve itself. Other big thing, 2004, there was a lot of talk about what can we do with goal-seeking characters, right? And obviously, characters who do more interesting things have been around for a long time. We saw Thorin singing about gold back in the 80s. But the ambition here was something that went beyond that, where you were able to give characters really complex ambitions about what they were going to accomplish in the story, and they would make plans about how they were going to bring those things to fruition and wander around your game world and try to do those things. So this is an example piece called Battle of Wolcott Heath, where it actually is simulating a battle with dozens and dozens of actual soldiers running around the space doing things, and you are just a ghost. So your dead body lies at your feet is because you are deceased and you are wandering the battlefield watching what everybody else is doing. And so you get these long outputs of 5 royalist men-at-arms and 2 royalist archers are standing here. Baron Geoffrey is sitting on the chestnut horse. 2 rebel men-at-arms, 4 rebel archers, and Lord Ranulph are standing on the north wall. 3 royalist men-at-arms and a ruddy royalist archer are standing in the ditch. And then more. And the more tag is where this description goes on for like another page. Because giving you the description of what all of these different characters is doing takes such a long time. But the ambition was, what if we could get something that had that kind of complexity that we might now associate with The Sims or Dwarf Fortress or any of those like really kind of heavy simulation things? What if we could do that in an IF context? And what if we could bring that together with a story so that when the characters go around and do interesting things, those might trigger narrative beats, like maybe the characters manage to achieve taking the keep of this castle, and then something narratively interesting happens as a result. But the thing that we were struggling with was, how do you represent that elegantly and clearly in text? Like, when you have that much quantitative information going on, how do you get that across to the player in a way that is not completely overwhelming? And this example kind of demonstrates the challenge, but many of the other people who are working in this space were kind of running into that same issue. This is one that's, I guess we're going to have moral choices in more detail later, but this is a point in IF history where this became quite interesting to people was the idea of interactive fiction that was testing the player's moral commitments. What do they want to do? What are they willing to do? Victor Heisberg is especially interested in this problem. And The Baron is a game in which you're in actually quite a sticky situation, which for once I won't spoil exactly what's going on, but it's something quite dark. And you have the opportunity of taking various choices, and then the game will actually ask you why you did those things. So for instance, there's a point in the game where you can kill a wolf cub, and then it will come back and ask you, okay, why did you decide to do that? Was it because you know that you just killed its mother and so it's going to starve anyway, and thus it was an act of compassion? Was it because you're afraid of it growing up and becoming dangerous to you? And so you get these sort of options of not just specifying what your action was, but what was your reason for doing that action, and what does that mean about how you're approaching this story. Float Point was a piece that I did. There were several other pieces that people were generating at this point where the interest was really in making the story almost into a machine for having a philosophical discussion with the player. Like, not just can we make them feel uncomfortable and uncertain about what they should do next, but can we actually, depending on what they choose at the beginning of the story, can we change the story to challenge them further about the commitments that they've made morally? And where does that lead us? Where do we get to? So another piece in this line is Victor's game Fate. And that also is about kind of an escalating problem where you have to keep deciding what you're going to do about it. And this was a point where, when we were working at it, like every single one of these steps is something where at the time we thought, all right, this is what interactive fiction is going to be like forevermore. And then actually, in this particular case, there were a few more things like this, but actually this did not become a major IF genre. There are some pieces like that, and then we sort of moved on. 2008, Blue Lacuna. Now this is an amazing game in several respects. It's a really huge, sort of substantial world that's built on Myst fandom. So you've got the kind of experience of traveling through all of these spaces that feel like they are populated by trees and strange machinery and so on. But it's also really tracking what you're doing and building up this idea of what has the player seen so far, so what do I need to show them next in order to move them forward in the story, and also what do the NPCs think about you. And so that kind of drama management element of there's a piece of this system that is actually picking what to show you next in the story. Maybe that's the way forward. Maybe that's the way we can get people kind of narratively engrossed in this. So the next several pieces are actually not so much pieces about content, but pieces about how are we going to make this commercially viable. And this was a question that came up over and over and over again. But in 2009, we had Jack Torresall and The Secret Letter by Textfire, which is an attempt to make a sort of a commercial game that you could sell for $20 and have that actually work. And they did some sort of exploration of what could we do with the user interface in order to make that look like a good value proposition. That didn't really particularly work out. I don't think I'm spoiling anything to say. But then there were other explorations. Okay, well, maybe we could couple with, Jay's games and there's lots of indie games that are making money right now. And at the time, like, this is possibly the funniest / stupidest prediction that I've ever made about the future of IF, which is where I said, like, oh yes, there are more and more casual gamers out there, and so what we need to do is create interactive fiction that gives like a good, satisfying, puzzly experience in sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and then work with these sort of puzzle game or sites that cater to that kind of audience and get a lot of ad revenue, because of course ad revenue will continue to come through forever. And that also did not happen. Another thing, kickstarting IF, Hadean Lands, Andrew Plotkin's Kickstarter for $31,337. He managed to get together some funds to write a piece of Parser IF without the, how crowdfunding works, but there are sort of all of these different models of how are we going to do this, how are we going to get it off the ground. And then the other thing that we were trying to do around the same time was, books, right? Like, publishers have money, and what we're doing is kind of like books. So what we should do is try and do something that is interactive publishing and feels more literary and reaches out to a reading crowd, and maybe we can do something by making our presentation style more attractive, and maybe that will work. But there were sort of a lot of germs of ideas, and people putting quite a lot of commitment into those ideas. The other major thing that happened in 2012 was the Twine Revolution. This is Porpentine's Howling Dogs, but this is a point at which a lot of people started writing interactive fiction in Twine, and the point at which the interactive fiction community, which has up to this point in the story considered itself a text adventure community, started thinking of itself as something bigger than that, and started including Twine to a greater and greater degree in more and more choice-based works, also in interactive fiction competitions, in other things that we were doing. And I don't want to pretend like this is not a story of the IF community inventing the idea of choice-based interactive fiction. This is a story of us grudgingly, slowly, and very late admitting that there was something of huge value happening over here, which we should probably be paying attention to. But that also made a huge change in kind of what the community saw itself as, and suddenly people were talking about, like, okay, what do we want to do in order to make our community more inclusive to different types of authors and all of those kinds of topics, which we still really have not solved, but we're working on it more than we were at the time. The YOG, a piece with sort of non-massively multiplayer IF, where you are playing with 3 or 4 other people and making choices jointly. So this question of how do we tell stories in which different people are able to contribute in different ways and have that be a coherent story that is interestingly interactive for multiple people is another topic. And I'm still, like, earlier ones, I'm like, okay, we've given up on that future is probably not happening, or else that future has come to fruition. This is one where I feel like the jury is still out. Like, I'm still really interested in this question. I don't think we've solved it yet, but I think there might be something there. And then in the last year or two, the idea of limited parser IF, where there's a very tightly well-defined set of verbs available to the player. We make it really clear, like, this is not about you can do anything you want. We're going to tell you the 3 verbs you can use in this game. That's it. And that is a different way of kind of making the game accessible to people who might not come in from that background. So this is going to be a rapid montage because I'm running out of time. But now, now we've got all of these things going on in the IF space. Event Zero, if you haven't tried it, is actually taking chatbot style input where you're talking to the AI inside the computer and giving it commands, but also persuading it not to hate you, which is challenging. Code 7 has more sort of traditional choices in it, but is augmenting that with voiceovers and with all kinds of sort of map elements. Voyageur is doing procedurally generated text about locations that you're visiting over the course of your experience. This one is not so much a work as a cultural fact that Porpentine has a major exhibit in the Whitney Museum of American Art, which is kind of a big deal. This is Southern Monsters, which is forthcoming from Kevin Snow, which is a really a Twine piece about exploring life in the South, particular stories about that. And so there's the point that I want to kind of get to here in the last couple minutes is there's a huge amount going on right now. All of these things, and then Icebound Compendium, which is doing IF supported by AR, Robin Johnson's Detective Land, which is doing a parser choice hybrid. So what has happened to IF recently is that our definition of what it is has massively exploded. And in the things on this screen, you can see the ramifications of a lot of those past futures, right? Like, there are a lot of ideas around, can we make this more accessible? Can we make it more fun? The idea of, like, type whatever you want has even come back with Event Zero, right? And they've got a different way of approaching that problem that reintroduces the possibility of doing that effectively. And at the same time, lots of different explorations about what could the front end look like? What could this feel like? So many of those things have essentially come true, and there's a room for quite a lot more at this point. So the moment is, explosive diversity, which is a wonderful place to wind up.